Hello, everyone. My name is Carissa. I am in your Social Work 733 class. I'm excited to be talking with you today about childhood trauma and supportive services for children within the educational setting. Um, for this project, since we're going over the macro intervention and the planning of that macro intervention, I will be focusing on TBRI, which stands for Trust-Based Relational Intervention. So the target population that I will be focusing on is school-age children from 3 to 18 years old. They will be in rural communities, and these communities will typically be low income and have below the poverty line for the family. Public education professionals and mental health professionals. I think it's important to point out that trauma has become a buzzword in our society, and it's crucial to recognize that more people are speaking out about their own trauma from their childhoods and how that affects the way that we view trauma. Trauma used to be something that very few and far in between talked about, and now it's being talked about a lot more. So we need to be able to understand if our definition of trauma and their definition of trauma are the same to make sure that we're understanding them correctly. And then I did want to point out that right now I'm completing my MSW field practicum at an elementary school in my local town. We are pre-K through 5th grade. We have roughly 130 students, so our teacher to student ratio is really low. And many of the children that I see on a daily basis are living in poverty and have very traumatic childhoods. They have multiple ACEs, and by the time they leave our building, they have more ACEs than when they came in. So I just think that that's important to note on why I focused on this topic today. Just for some context, in 2020, 38.9% of families living within the town that I am completing my field practicum in are living below the poverty line. So some of the stakeholders that are included within this topic are children and families, educational professionals, community mental health providers, social workers, medical field professionals, and law enforcement workers. All of these people play their part into implementing TBRI into an educational setting. So next, we're going to focus on the research of ACEs and TBRI. Sorry, I got to move my face around a little bit here. So when I was doing my research, I found that we really didn't start identifying trauma until we started seeing it in veterans of World War, the Civil War, and that was right around 1860s that practitioners, medical practitioners, really started to see the effects that war traumas had on people. And so we started out with this small group of people that we were really seeing trauma with. And then in 1997, we went over the ACEs study. And the ACEs study is the Adverse Childhood Events Study that was completed in 1997. And it was completed to look at the correlation between adverse childhood events and negative health outcomes. In the school setting, these negative health outcomes were referring to speech delays, reading delays, all for the kids' age. And these are all things that would affect their academic performance. They would be more likely to be referred to special education services. So we started off with a small group of people that had served our country. Then we went to a larger population of children who have experienced adverse childhood events. And then in 2010, we really narrowed it down to trauma supports in rural school settings. So I think it's important to point out that there are so many different aspects of trauma, and every population, every group, every culture experiences trauma differently and goes through that process of healing differently. So in this case, I picked out a few of the main studies that related to my topic of childhood trauma. The 2010 study was focusing on the rural populations and what evidence-based interventions had been used. So it really differentiated that between the rural setting and the urban setting. And I found in that study that it's important for me to read a quote from there. So the quote is that when trauma is left untreated, these students are placed on a trajectory of increased risk for continued emotional and behavioral difficulties and psychopathology into adulthood, end quote. So I think that it's important that we recognize that we have to start treating trauma as soon as possible. As soon as that trauma is identified, we have to start treating it. We can't wait till these kids grow up to be adults and have psychopathology tendencies, or if they have any form of mental illness, we cannot wait until then to treat them. We have to work through this when they're children as well, which is where TBRI, or trust-based relational intervention, came in. In 2014, they implemented TBRI into a school-based setting with at-risk youth in a residential center. Since it was in a residential center where the kids also went to school, it was considered a school setting. So now we're going to go over the basis of TBRI. Okay, so TBRI is based on 3 principles: empowering, connecting, and correcting. Empowering is based on felt safety and nurture, and providing for physical needs such as food, water, shelter. And the second one, connecting, is based on mindfulness and engagement. So creating those healthy emotional relationships, keeping a calm and positive atmosphere for these kids to grow and learn. And number 3 is correction, which is where most people's minds go to when we think about behavior management, is correction. Utilizing the ideal response and nurture groups. Both of those terms are coined through TBRI. And the ideal response, as you can see below, is immediate, direct, efficient, action-based, and leveled at behavior. The only one that I think that needs explaining further is the leveled at behavior. So when we go through the correction, we need to ensure that we're choosing the right engagement strategy to be able to get these kids' attentions when they're in crisis. So those 4 options are playful engagement, structured engagement, calming engagement, and protective engagement. Now, to be able to choose which one you want, you have to be able to go through empowering and connecting first. So once you go through empowering and connecting, then that'll really help guide you through the correction process. Nurture groups are also used in TBRI, and those are in place to create an atmosphere where children can learn necessary life skills, like giving care, receiving care, negotiating needs, and being autonomous. Those are all things that need to be considered when doing a nurture group. And these are all things that children need to learn as they grow up and become social beings in the real world. So we need to look at the fact that nurture groups are already being implemented in different ways in the classroom settings, such as morning meetings. Some teachers implement a morning meeting for children to just talk about what they're feeling, what happened the night before, just to give them that opportunity to talk, which really goes into that negotiating needs and being autonomous. But in order for it to be a true nurture group, we also need to look into giving care if the kid is feeling overwhelmed or in the red or sad, mad, angry, any of those emotions. And then next we'll be going over the macro planning for this intervention. So for TBRI, the target for change can be looked at from both micro and macro settings. Micro would be providing appropriate modeled social behavior when dealing with a crisis or a reaction to the environment. Ultimately, we want to be proactive, not reactive. And then macro would be creating a blueprint within the education system to identify and assist children with growing through their complex childhood traumas. So we need to be able to create a system that will help us identify which kids we need to really focus on and give them that connection, that empowerment, and that correction. Um, to go along with this, there's a lot of needs that need to be met before we really create this blueprint. Those being community buy-in, professional buy-in, qualified training professionals, review boards, multidisciplinary professionals within the school system, OTs, PTs, speech therapists. All of those things need to be considered. And then when looking at the theory behind TBRI really utilizes a holistic approach. It looks at the child when they're at home, it looks at the child at school, when they're with family members, when they're with friends. All of those things come into consideration and how it affects their academic learning. And it also goes into detail about their attachments and how their attachment styles can differ and how TBRI can help us attach and have those relationships with kids that don't necessarily have those attachments with anyone else. And then it also is based on neuroscientific research because we go over their heart rate, their eating schedules, their sleep schedules, all of those things. Some of the potential challenges of TBRI is the denial of traumatic experiences. Parents can feel offended, they can feel ashamed if their child has experienced traumatic events. But it's important to note that not all traumatic events are preventable. At some point, there is nothing that anyone can do to help protect another person, but what we can do is we can be there when those things do happen. And I believe that TBRI would help us do that. Another challenge that we need to consider is teacher buy-in. Are these kids going to have to be out of class time for additional therapy, to meet with mental health providers? Teachers already have such stressful jobs, making sure that these children are getting all of the instructional time that they need. So this out of class time has to be considered. There's lack of training professionals. There's lack of the workforce everywhere in every field. So we have to consider that. Is there going to be enough training professionals to train everyone in the school system, all the educational professionals? We also have to look at cultural differences. Some people have a different cultural perspective on what correction or consequences should look like. So it needs to be viewed first under that cultural lens. Is the cultural lens matching up with the TBRI correcting principle, or are they slightly off? Do we need to make some changes to make sure that this flows better with the culture of the environment and the community? Those sorts of things. And then another challenge is lack of community support. There just might not be enough mental health providers, enough counselors, enough teachers that are willing to put in the time to implement TBRI. And with all of that being said, we need to create a space where these teachers and these educational professionals feel supported. So I think that it would take about a year to get all of our staff trained, all of them get to practice and go to all of the additional trainings that teach them how to utilize these skills in a classroom setting, give them a year to slowly implement them in order to give them time to create those supports and create those changes in their classrooms. With that, I will leave you with this. 46% of youth under the age of 18 have experienced one or more traumatic events that may impact their development through their lifespan. And that was from Maria Franklin, which I have the article linked below in the references page. And if 46% of youth having one or more ACE isn't enough, in 2018, 30% of rural children under the age of 17 have experienced two or more ACEs, which means they're double or twice as likely to experience development impacts throughout their life. Thank you guys for listening. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Children need competent and intentional interventions in place to help fight this social problem of complex childhood trauma. Thanks for listening.